Hi fellow PowerAppers, Paul here with a new PowerApps video for you. In fact, a new series of videos because I want to tackle the topic of how to make your PowerApps faster. And that's a big topic with a lot of different things to consider. Hence, I'm going to do a series of videos so that we can break it down into smaller sections. So this is obviously part one, the intro. In this intro, I will talk about some general considerations for making your apps quicker, and also we'll have an explanation of delegation. So you've probably heard the term delegation. We'll go through exactly what that means because it's very important for trying to make sure that your apps run quickly and smoothly. In video 2, I'm going to have a little look at the different data sources that we commonly use in PowerApps. There are other ones, but I guess the big ones are Excel, SharePoint, CDS, Dynamics, and Azure SQL Server. So we'll have a little comparison of how they stack up. Now, in my view, Azure SQL Server is by far the best data source to use, but there are licensing implications and architecture and all sorts of other things to keep in mind. So sometimes you can get away with using something else, or sometimes you don't have the choice of what you're going to use. You need to plug into an existing system. So we'll just see what the considerations are and what you can do with each of those data sources. Video 3 will be about identifying bottlenecks in your app. You might have a relatively large app that's running slow overall and you're not sure which screens, which functions, what it is that's causing it to be slow. So we're going to try and show you how you can really focus in, narrow down on the parts of the app that are problematic so you can focus on those. We'll be looking at the app checker, we'll be looking at the monitor tool. The app checker, at least as far as identifying where there are delegation issues is concerned, is not 100%. Sometimes it reports that a formula is fine when in actual fact it's not delegating. So I'll show you some other ways where you can try and determine what's happening. Number 4, writing delegable filters. So delegation again. I'm going to be explaining delegation shortly, but we'll show you how you can try to make your filters delegable. Can't make all filters delegables. There are some functions that you just can't delegate, but there are also times when you're combining various functions together, and if you combine them in certain ways they will delegate, if you combine them in other ways they won't. So anyway, we'll focus in on that in video 4. Video 5, I'll have a little look at the advanced settings, or at least the ones that relate to your app performance. So particularly thinking here about things like the explicit column selection, the delayed load behavior, and the non-blocking app on start behavior. And we'll see how those can influence your app. You don't always just want to switch these settings on, so new settings appear from time to time as Microsoft improves the product, but it's not always a good idea to turn them on. You want to know what the benefits are and what the possible repercussions are as well. So I'll look at that in video 5. In video 6, we'll have a look at some app design considerations. We're going to touch on those in other places anyway, but I think I'll do a summary at the end just to put that all into one place. Okay, so the intro then. Considerations, what things should you think about when you want to be making fast apps? Well, there are some things which are external to PowerApps itself that you should also consider. Network speeds. Your Power App is going to be communicating with your data source over the network. If you've got poor network connection, if you've got slow speeds, then inevitably your Power App is going to be slow as well. So that's something you want to keep in mind. I recently was working on a project where we were rolling out apps to service centres, where all of the service centres had fantastic broadband gigabit Ethernet connections into the service centre, but we were still having really terrible performance, and a little bit of investigation revealed that what was happening was the network in those service centres was set up so that only a tiny proportion of that available gigabit bandwidth was being shared over the Wi-Fi network, and people were using mobile devices over Wi-Fi. So we were simply able to change some of those network configuration settings and get a massive boost to our PowerApps performance. Similarly, devices. Look, if you're using $200 commodity phones and tablets, they're not going to stack up against $1,000 phones and tablets. You are going to get significant variations in performance across different devices. So in my experience, you can be looking at sort of 2-3 times longer to open screens and respond to taps on the lower end devices than on the top of the range devices, and that can be problematic. So really, I guess the lesson there is, look, when you're embarking on a project, try and find out what the network conditions are going to be, what sort of devices people are going to be using, and make sure that you're testing against that so that you've got a good idea of what this thing is going to behave like for the users in the real world. Okay, looking at PowerApps itself then. Delegation. Let's start talking about delegation. Here we go. Let's go. That was where I was practicing earlier. Okay, so let's do a new diagram. Here, this is our app, and let's say our app is looking at sales data, and one of the features in our app is that we can select the sales data for a particular salesperson. So let's say we want to see the sales data for Jane. So maybe we've got a little drop down in our Power App there, and we select Jane, and then we want Jane's information to start appearing underneath. So we select Jane, and that sends a request off to our data source, our database, whatever it may be, that says, okay, I want the sales data for Jane. So our sales data is going to be in a tabular format. So we're going to have the salesperson, perhaps we've got the dollar amount, perhaps we've got the date and so on as columns in our tabular data, and then each row represents an individual sale. In Azure SQL Server terms, we call this a table. In CDS and Dynamics, it's an entity. In SharePoint, it's a list, but it's all the same thing. It's rows and columns, doesn't matter. Okay, so we've sent our request that says we want the data for Jane, so we've just got a few rows in our data source for Jane. If our request is delegable, then what's going to happen is our data source is going to find those records for Jane for us, and it's going to send just those records back. So let me think how I'll draw this. I'll draw this like that because they're all coming back in one go. So we're getting just 3 records. So that's if your filter, your request for the data is delegable. You're delegating the work to the data source. The data source is going to pick out the information you need and just send the information back that you want. Okay, let's say that it is not delegable. So let's take this lines off here. Okay, in that case, the database understands that you want sales information, but it doesn't understand the filter that you're applying. So it can't apply that filter. It can't pick out those records for you. So what it needs to do is to say, hey, PowerApps, here is all of that sales data. You go and pick out the ones that you're interested in. So in the one example, we were sending back just 3 rows. This table could be any size at all. For the sake of this example, let's say this table is 1,000 rows of data. Okay, now rather than sending 3 rows back to PowerApps, you're sending 1,000 rows of data back to PowerApps. And that's obviously going to take a lot longer. It's also got an impact on your data source. It's hitting your data source harder. Your data source has got to do a bit more work, possibly pulling that information out, and it's certainly hitting your networking harder as well. So you want to try to delegate wherever you can. Another issue or consideration with delegation is there is a limit to how much data PowerApps can pull from a data source or request from a data source in one go. Now the default is 500 records, but you can crank that up to 2,000 in the advanced settings. So that's the delegation limit. Let's say that we've left our delegation limit at 500. And we've got this table which has got 1,000 rows in it. Now let's say that the split for the 500 rows is about here. There we are. If our request is not delegable, then our data source is going to send us back just the first 500 rows, because it can only send back up to the delegation limit. So in this case, clear that off again. What we would get is the first 500 rows sent back, which might only have one of Jane's records in them. Perhaps Jane's other records are further down in the table at row sort of 600, row 700. These rows wouldn't even be returned. So delegation is great because it means that we have a faster app because we're only pulling back the data that we need, and it also means we're more likely to find the data that we need as well. Okay, this often catches people out when they're new to PowerApps because they start working with some sample data which is relatively small and it's within the delegation limit, so they're seeing the results they expect, and then they start loading more data in and saying, well, hang on a minute, something is definitely wrong here because I've said give me Jane's data and I know I've got 3 sales for Jane, but I'm only seeing 1 within my app. So careful with the delegation and the delegation limits. One other interesting feature of delegation is how it works with galleries in PowerApps. So a gallery in PowerApps is, I was going to say vertical, you can have horizontal galleries as well, but it's a series of repeating elements. So you get a repeated element, the elements they call templates, you get a repeated element template for each row in your data, in your source of data for your gallery. Now, if the data source for your gallery is delegable, then what will happen is the gallery will pull in the first 100 records initially. So let's say that we've actually got 350 records within our data source that we are going to be showing in our gallery. Assuming that we can delegate, it's a delegable request, what it will do is it will pull back the first 100 items and populate the gallery, and then the gallery populates nice and quickly. It's not pulling back all 350. As you scroll down, when you get to the bottom, or as you scroll with your finger, as you get to the bottom of the list, to the bottom of the gallery, then the gallery will automatically load the next 100 items. So your gallery has now got 200 items in it. So the performance on screen, or what you see on screen, is you scroll to the bottom of the list, you get a little delay, and then that scroll block moves back up a little bit because you've got more records underneath, and then you can continue to scroll down again, and as you get down to the bottom it loads in the next 100 records. So now I've got 300 in my gallery, and it will just keep on and on and on doing that. And that can be really useful because it's rare that you have a user experience, or rare that you want a user experience where users should be scrolling through more than 100 items. So generally 100 is probably going to be enough. You know, what you want to do is you want to be having sort of additional ways of filtering your data on there so that you can get down to a manageable number of records rather than expecting the user to scroll all day long through hundreds of them. And it means that your gallery populates nice and quickly. So if my data source is not delegable, then all, in this particular example, 350 records are going to end up being loaded in one go into the gallery, and that's going to take longer. Longer to pull the data, and also it's going to take more time for the gallery to render all of those additional records, because PowerApps has got to do a little bit of work for every record that appears to fill in the labels and the text boxes and the other controls that are going to be on there. So that's what happens if your data source is delegable. Your gallery will bring back 100 records at a time. You can force the behavior. You can use a function like first n, you can use that function to say, look, overwrite the ordinary behavior and bring me in the first 500 records or the first 1,000 records or whatever it is. Obviously, you're always bound by the delegation limit, which is set in your advanced settings. Okay, so that is our delegation. One thing just to keep in mind in terms of the performance, before we move away from delegation, is let's say that you have a filter which is bringing back 50 records and you've got another one which is bringing back 100 records. What's the time comparison with those? Does it take twice as long to get 100 records than it takes to get 50 records? No, because your request is made up, if you think about it, of different parts. You've got the actual details of your request, which are being sent from PowerApps to the data source. In fact, let me do that. So if you imagine this is a timeline, we've got a little bit of time for the request to go. Then we've got a little bit of time for your data source to process the request, to go and get those matching records. And then we've got the time it takes to actually return those records to the app. So there's always a little bit of overhead. So if you're working really hard to try to make a filter delegable, and that filter would return something like 50 records, and your total number of records are 100, so if it was non-delegable you'd be pulling all 100 and then you'd be trying to find it in there. The time difference is going to be marginal. It's not going to be a huge time difference. But if you're talking about picking out, 3 or 4 rows instead of 1,000 rows, you really are going to notice the difference there. Let me just, I think I've got a screen here. So this is a screen from the monitor tool, so we'll be having a little look at that in one of our videos. And what I've done here is I've done 2 requests, and one request returned a response size of 3,000, the other one 1,500. So this response, this call for data, returned about twice as much data as this lower one. But if you have a look at the actual time difference, it's not enormous. Okay, so we've got nearly 200 versus 188 milliseconds. Now there's other things that can be going on as well, of course. So not every request across the network takes the same time. There's all sorts of things on that journey that can cause various slowdowns. But typically, if you're just talking about 50 records or something different, you're probably not going to notice a massive difference. But once you start talking hundreds of records, it really does make a big difference. So definitely worth trying to do your delegation. Okay, so that was delegation. The structure of your app. So we can look at the structure of your app in a couple of different ways. So let's think about the logical or the process structure of your app. So what I mean there is what tasks happen when your user is using your app. So you can make your app seem faster, or at least you can make the slowness of your app less annoying if you structure your app so that the slow tasks happen when your user is not under pressure trying to get things done in your app. So let's try and give an example of that. Let's get ourselves to a little bit of empty space on here. So I had an app where someone is standing with a customer who is delivering their car. There's some work to be done on their car, and the technician using the app is going to take a bunch of photos of any existing damage on the car, just so that there's no arguments later. Someone doesn't say, hey, I dropped my car off and when I got it back, you put a dent in it. So it's getting that evidence. Anyway, that's the scenario. So we've got a situation where you've got a customer standing next to a technician, and the technician is taking photos of any damage, and they might need to take several photos. So let's say that technician needs to take 10 photos. So here's my little image of a photo. So they've got to take 10 photos, and taking the photo takes, let's say, 5 seconds, because what we're doing when we take the photo is we're pushing that photo up to Azure blob storage, and we are setting a secure URL which we get back from Azure blob storage, and then we're saving that into our database so that we've got a reference so that we can go and find that file later. So let's say that process takes about 5 seconds, and we're taking 10 photos, so all in all we're going to have 50 seconds worth of uploading of data going on during this process. Now, the way we originally structured the app was they take the photo, it goes straight to the database. So they take the photo and then they've got to wait. You know, if they're a distance from the Wi-Fi connection, maybe it's going to take 10 seconds rather than 5 seconds, but you've got that uncomfortable pause, you've taken the photo, you've got a customer standing next to you, you're waiting, it makes it feel even longer than it is. So what we did is we simply restructured the app to say, okay, when you take the photos, just cache those photos on the device. Don't do anything with them yet, just take the photos, so as soon as you've taken one, you're ready to take another. And then at the end of the interaction with the customer, when you've said goodbye to the customer and you hit the button to say, okay, yep, we're finished, only at that point does it load all of those images. So it's still taking, let's say, 50 seconds to load those 10 images, but it's doing it all in one go, and it's doing it when the app isn't otherwise being used. So even if there's a queue of customers who are waiting to drop their cars off, once you've said goodbye to one customer, it's going to take you a while to walk over to the next car, say hello to the customer, you know, discuss what nice weather it is, and then start taking your photos. So it doesn't feel like such an interruption. So have a think about how your users are going to be interacting with your app, and the points in your app at which you actually send data backwards and forwards, because it may well be that you can make your app feel faster. You know, you can push those slow parts of your app to times when it's not critical, and you can make sure that when it is critical, your app is running very quickly. So another example of that is going to be things like downloading reference lists. So if you download those when the app initially loads, rather than download them every time you go into the relevant screen, then again, you know, you're going to be having better performance in terms of what's happening when you're stood with the customer, those critical times when the app needs to run fast. So that was sort of the logical process type considerations. So think about the design of your app, how it's actually going to be used, when it needs to be fast, when there are downtimes, when you know, you can have those bigger data operations taking place. Technical, so just to run over this quickly, try and find myself a bit of space again. Here we go. Let's say that you've got an app with several screens in it. Here we go. Screen A and screen B and screen C. There's an option under the advanced settings, I'll go through them in more detail as I say in a later video, but something called delayed loading. And what that does is it tries to make it faster for your app to fire up from cold. So your app is not running and you tap on the icon to start the app, or you click on the link to start the app, and you want your app to start very, very quickly, then you might switch on delayed loading. And what that will do is it will say, okay, I'm going to make the app available to use as soon as I've got screen A loaded. So the app starts, screen A loads, and you're off and running. Then when you click on something on screen A, which brings up screen B, then screen B will load. And when you click on something on screen B to load screen C, then screen C will load. So the first time you go from screen A to screen B, it's actually going to take longer because screen B isn't loaded yet. Okay, so that's delayed loading. If you want a really fast startup time and you don't mind your first jump into the different screens taking a little bit longer, then delayed loading can be a good option. There is a limit to delayed loading, which is that if screen A references something on screen B, then screen B has to be loaded. So as the app starts up, screen A is loaded, it starts looking at all of your formulas and all of your controls and things. It sees there's a reference to screen B, and then it's got to load screen B anyway. And then if screen B has a reference to screen C, it's got to load screen C anyway. So in that case, delayed loading wouldn't make any difference because all of those screens have got to be loaded in any case. And again, you need to think about what do you want your app to do. In the example of that Service Center app, it's going to be run on a tablet or a phone which is switched on first thing in the morning before the store is even open. So it doesn't matter how long it takes to initially load, but you want it to be quick right from the get-go. It's not going to be turned off until the end of the day. It's just going to run that same app all day long. So in that case, I wouldn't bother with delayed loading. I'd say, look, I want the whole app to load up completely so that everything is in there. So the first time you use it, it's going to go as quickly as possible. Whereas if you've got other Power Apps where you're expecting people just to fire up the Power App, record a quick bit of information and then come back out again, then delayed loading might be a good option for that, particularly if several of the screens in the app are kind of optional. Depending on what you're doing, you might never ever go to screen D. So if you never go to screen D, there's no point in waiting for it to load when the app is first starting up. Right, so that was our introduction. Oops, just do that like that. So that's what we've covered. In the next video, as I say, we will cover the, get my list, we will compare the different data sources and see what the pros and cons of each of those data sources are. I hope that's been useful. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe because the other videos will be coming down the line in the coming days and weeks. Thank you very much and enjoy your power apping.